In cooperation with the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission and America 2026, Symposia is proud to present a special documentary series. In cooperation with the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission and America 2026, Symposia is proud to present Sister Revolutions.
Welcome to Sister Revolutions, a multi-episode series about the dual histories of Besançon, France, and Charlottesville, USA in the long 18th century. I'm Benjamin Bernard, a historian at the University of Virginia.
And I'm Sage Tanguay, the producer of Symposia at Brown Residential College that's hosting this podcast series. Over the course of this mini-series, you'll hear about how the French and American revolutions affected our two cities and the role that our cities played in the founding of two new nations. So Ben, what inspired this project?
Well, Sage, it really started with the sister cities' cultural diplomatic relationship between our two towns, Charlottesville and Besançon. I began to wonder how we could use that relationship to understand the histories of our cities better through comparison. As a historian, I study the age of democratic revolutions, and stories of revolutions tend often to be national stories, or at least of capital cities. And I began to wonder how local experiences maybe do or don't track with those national stories. So can that local experience contradict or complement in some way the stories that we tell about the revolutions? And I think this kind of question is important for our communities today to be able to connect with the histories of our democracy and our nation. So let's do a quick example to see what I mean. Sage, what do you think of when you think of Charlottesville in the 18th century?
Well, of course, here at the University of Virginia, we're just absolutely immersed in Jeffersonian history. I mean, Monticello, Thomas Jefferson's estate, is a big tourist attraction of the town.
And not to mention the University of Virginia, too. That's exactly right. So did you know that the American ambassador to France during the Revolution is from Charlottesville?
Isn't it Thomas Jefferson?
Yeah, it's Jefferson, who became the third president of the USA. Okay, but did you also know, that the French ambassador to America during the French Revolution did his military training in Besançon and came from a family in Franche-Comté?
See, that's the one I didn't know. I knew Jefferson went to France, but I definitely didn't know that the French ambassador was in Besançon. I think that's wild.
Okay, absolutely. So his name is Dumoutier, and I think it's pretty interesting that America's first diplomatic friendship is forged by these two statesmen, one from Charlottesville and the other from Besançon. A question immediately comes to mind for me. What was it about those two cities in that moment that made them able to produce these statesmen that would become so important for this founding diplomatic relationship? The answer to that question is going to tell us something new potentially about our two cities.
What I'm wondering is, what does it really mean to be sister cities now? And I think maybe understanding this history can help us be better sister cities today.
Well, exactly. I think we can articulate in each new moment what that relationship of sister cities means. And that's easier to do when we have a better handle on where we're coming from. I should add, too, that there's a great deal of excitement among historians right now for 2026. That's going to be the 250th anniversary or semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. So historians in the next couple years will be assessing the legacy of the revolution.
So we received a grant from the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission, supplemented by Brown College and the America 2026 Commission. And using this funding, we traveled to Besançon to interview historians and curators, and to meet city representatives and to tour historic sites. Over the course of this mini-series, we're going to tell the stories of Besançon and Charlottesville, from the late 1600s through the French and American revolutions in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
In the episodes to come, you'll be hearing about the fantastic cultural and economic efflorescence of the city through the 18th century Enlightenment, as well as the Byzantine experience with the French Revolution. Then we'll return to Charlottesville to consider its history during this period and how that period is remembered today. So let's begin today with Besançon. The first step to the French Revolution, after all, was becoming French. So in this first episode, we're going to talk about how Besançon became part of the French kingdom under the absolutist King Louis XIV, focusing on the 1660s to 1680s.
To do that, we'll meet curators at the Cathedral of Besançon and the citadel overlooking the city. On the way to Besançon, we stopped in Paris, where we met up with one of Ben's old colleagues at a bustling cafe to discuss comparative revolutionary history.
I'm Caitlin Carter. I am an assistant professor of history at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. And I study the origin of representative democracy in the late 18th century, looking primarily at the United States and France and how they set up representative government kind of for the first time.
Caitlin Carter was a few years ahead of me in graduate school. We did our doctoral degrees in history at Princeton with the same advisor, David Bell. Caitlin's always been interested in the comparative history of revolutions. Her work and her teaching as well deal with the French and American revolutions as part of a common Atlantic culture.
Let's take a listen to our conversation with her.
What do we mean as historians when we talk about the French Revolution or the American Revolution?
That's such a great question. I mean, often we talk about the late 18th into the 19th century as an age of revolutions. I say revolutions with an S. Sometimes you'll see age of revolution without an S. And I think there's not a lot of serious debate about that, but I actually do think that encompasses a lot of the kind of questions that you're raising, which is, if we think about this as an age where there are a lot of revolutions in the sense of changes of political regime, that's one way of looking at it. You could also look at it as a time when there's a lot of experimentation in terms of thinking about social hierarchies and thinking about religion in all these kind of different realms. So I think you're right. Like, it depends on what aspect you're interested in, how you would talk about what these different revolutions are about or what their outcomes are. All of that depends on where you put the end point of that revolution or what aspect of it you're focusing on.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the comparative method does for your understanding and historians' understanding of the French and American revolutions?
Looking at them side by side can really help illuminate some of the unique factors in each situation that might show you, oh, this thing that wasn't a factor in, the United States clearly was a big factor in France, and it helps you see that and see kind of how it's operating by looking at a comparison where it's not there.
When we talk about the legacy of the Age of Revolutions today, I think as a historian, maybe you feel the same way. We sort of see the 18th century around us all the time, right? But I think we have these very nationally driven stories about the revolution. On the other hand, people today also have not just nationalist sentiment, but very local civic connections.
One thing that I tell my students, for example, we're studying the American Revolution, is that, especially right now in the United States, this is true, but the story of the history of a nation's founding, especially when the nation still exists as such and lives under the Constitution that was written at that moment, is always kind of tied up with national identity. It's thus inherently politicized in the present moment. It serves as this kind of mythology, right? And it makes doing history of that fraught.
Ben, could you describe your experience of entering Besançon for the first time?
Well, when we got out of the train station, it became immediately clear to me why the history of Besançon looks the way that it does. Because the train station is on a hill on one of the sort of lesser developed sides of town. It's a little more modern and industrial, but it's on a hill that overlooks the entire city in a kind of valley below it. So you have a quite a nice view from certain perspectives of the city and the river that hooks in this kind of oxbow around the historic city center. And then across the river, you have this massive cliff with the citadel sitting on top of it. I mean, you couldn't miss it.
No, absolutely not.
And so you could see this kind of strategic topography that gives the city such a characteristic shape and that also made it such an important garrison. It's a case study in geography and history going hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. It absolutely is a beautiful city, and it kind of reminded me a bit of Charlottesville. It's pretty forested, there are lots of hills.
It's also like not too big, but not too small either.
Exactly.
So if you want to walk across the city, you could kind of do it in an hour, but a bike would be better,
Yeah.
and a car isn't like completely necessary to get around. So many of the main roads have multiple lanes, so a lane for bikes, a lane for walkers, a lane for cars, a lane for buses and taxis. And that just seems so wonderful and practical that, you know, people commuting from outside the city can kind of go right to the parking lot and then get around from there by bus or on foot or by tram.
The other thing that's immediately noticeable is how old some of these buildings are. And I know that for you, it felt like an 18th century paradise of like, oh my gosh, so much of this is so old.
You know that scene in Disney's Beauty and the Beast where they're in a quiet village and then everyone comes out? It's like, you know, it's more built up than that, right? It's not an Alsatian village, but you know, you're walking around and you see this 18th century architecture in the city center. I mean, it's kind of astounding. I'm not sure that, you know, even after spending a dozen years in France and specifically looking out for 18th century sites, I'm not sure that I've been in a place quite like that where you feel that time capsule feeling a little bit.
Yeah, I would say architecture is a big part of the experience of being in Besançon. While we were exploring the town, we started going up this hill to the citadel. But before the citadel, you happen upon another really important historic landmark.
As you're walking up the road, you pass this kind of ruins of columns and in a little park on your left, and past Victor Hugo's house on your right, or at least the house in which he was born and lived 6 weeks. And you pass underneath this 2nd century Roman triumphal arch to go into the cathedral. The Black Gate, as it's called, dates back probably to the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. Sometimes triumphal arches have inscriptions on them, so you can know precisely what they were built for and when they were dated. It was called the Black Gate because it was dirty and covered in soda. Now that it's cleaned, it's not really black anymore.
Still the Black Gate, but yeah, it's a yellow gate, a wonderful yellow gate, but yeah, not black anymore.
So Mathieu is an art historian and a curator. His job essentially is to curate the cathedral itself. And so he works for the French state, for their cultural services, you know, in much the same way that an art historian might in a museum.
So this gate was the gate of a neighborhood, which was an independent city.
So it was a functional gate for the city.
It was in the 18th century. I can show you.
It is integrated into the kind of late medieval, early modern architecture of the houses around it, and specifically the domain of the archbishop. So the cathedral itself and the buildings around the cathedral are built into the Black Gate.
We entered in the realm of the archbishop when we went through the gate.
Okay.
So bringing the parliament from Dole to Besançon was a way to break down the power that the archbishop had on Besançon, because he had to deal with the new administrative power, and he has lost with the conquest all the rights he had like a lord. He could do the justice, make some kind of laws, and couldn't anymore because he was under the parliament. So it was a way for the king to say, yeah, I'm the master of the new region, and the archbishop instructs your power.
What I thought of when I first saw the Triumphal Arch is that when Louis XIV in the 17th century undertook wars of conquest in what were former Carolingian territories known as Lotharingia in the Middle Ages, so in the north of France, in what is now Belgium and so on, but also in the east, including conquering Besançon and Franche-Comté, he actually had erected 2 triumphal arches in Paris in the Roman style to commemorate these victories that were expanding the margins of his land empire. Didn't we go to see one of them in Paris?
We did.
Do you remember the kind of triumphal arch?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, as much as architecture is something that you experience while you're in this place, it's also clear that there's a historical code built into the buildings and these arches that we're seeing.
What's interesting to me is to think that Louis XIV basically conquered the city of Besançon and then brought into Paris this triumphal arch tradition that had marked the conquest of Besançon in the 2nd century in some form.
So while we're exploring this little green space that's right beside the Black Gate, we just had a funny interaction with some other people in the town.
My name is Noelle, and my mother is originally from Besançon. She immigrated to the United States with my father in the 1970s, so I was born and raised in San Francisco, California. But we've always come to this area to visit family and, learn about the area. And eventually I met my husband, Stivey, whose family is from Virginia. And when I visited his family and that area for the first time, I really started to see similarities between both places in terms of the geography, the plant communities, the hills, the caves, and the streets of the city as well. Just like the pedestrian streets, the buildings, the university vibe. And when I visited Charlottesville for the first time, it did actually strike me a lot.
And what about you, Stivey?
Well, my name is Stivey, and I was actually born in Mexico City. And like Noelle said, my dad is from Virginia. I would spend my summers in Virginia with my grandparents, and my cousins in Charlottesville, actually. But as we were driving down, we both were commenting how similar the landscape is. The sister city concept is actually one that I've tried to figure out, because a lot of times you see sister cities, they don't seem to have anything similar with each other, and it seems kind of a loose concept. It's like who decided they were sister cities. So I've actually thought about that in the past, because I've seen it. I was like, well, what does that have to do one with the other? But coming here, I definitely see the similarities, right? Obviously, a sister city isn't going to be exactly a replica, one or the other. So sister cities probably are more of a cultural connection than a physical connection, if that makes sense.
And I guess the big picture is, are these just efforts to bring people closer together and people across the globe to find similarities with one another? And look, maybe we do have some kind of common thread, some kind of common history and interests that, unite us. So the first time I went to Virginia and I tried Virginia ham, it took me back to France.
Really?
Yes. And there's a place in Culpeper called Calhoun's that makes like the most amazing Virginia ham. And I made Stivey's dad take me there because I said, this is the closest thing to jambon de Paris.
So obviously there are some noticeable similarities between Charlottesville and Besançon. But what is the whole sister cities relationship actually about?
My name's Elizabeth Smiley, and I'm currently on the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission. The sister city concept, actually, in the United States really started after World War II. It started in Europe immediately at the end of the Second World War as a peace-building initiative between countries who had been enemies during the war.
Wow.
France was actually where the sister city movement began. And it's grown ever since. And the idea is that the more connections we make with people in other countries and the more we get to know one another across countries, the more cultural understanding there is. That promotes a sense of global citizenship, and the more that promotes and sustains peace.
Do you know how and when and why Charlottesville and Besançon became paired as sister cities?
Well, I know a little bit. I wasn't there at the start, but it really started at the initiative of several people who, for various reasons, had lived and worked in Besançon. A woman named Louisa Dixon worked and lived in Besançon for many years and recognized how many similarities there were between Besançon and Charlottesville. When she returned to the United States, she was instrumental in beginning to talk to our city officials and to citizens in Charlottesville about the possibility of becoming sister cities. Really, I think she was the driving force. But she got the then city council and the then mayor very interested, and enough community members in Charlottesville got on board with that in 2004, we signed an official proclamation of friendship with Besançon, which starts the process of getting to know each other and courting, and that generally takes 2 to 3 years. And then in 2006, we became official sister cities.
So the next day, we headed out first thing to the cathedral. But Ben, why are we going to a medieval cathedral if this is an 18th century history podcast?
That is an excellent question. A couple reasons. First of all, I also kind of thought this might be a medieval story with the cathedral. I thought that, just looking at it, it looks maybe older than some of these like 18th century mansions and houses. Like it looks older than Monticello, right? I think we can agree on that. But it turns out that when you have an 18th century city, a city that comes to a kind of great prominence, everything is going to be refracted by that, right? Everything is going to be affected or changed in some way. And one of the things I was surprised to learn from Mathieu Fantoni about is just how much of an impact that century had on the history of religion and the cathedral.
So to set the scene a little bit for our listeners, imagine just walking into a giant cathedral with beautiful stained glass windows. As we begin to talk over some coffee, this beautiful organ music breaks out. Once again, here's Mathieu Fantoni, the curator of the cathedral.
So we have this golden age for the arts and the culture in the Renaissance time, and then the 17th century, well, it was a time of war. We call it the Great Century in France, le Grand Siècle, because we have this legend of the Sun King conquering and making. Actually, we have drawn the frontiers of France in the 17th century. Before we didn't have Alsace, not the Artois, so Franche-Comté, but actually it was a time of war.
Something I had to realize through the course of this project was that a country actually has to conquer itself, like the actual bounds of what constitutes the country. That was really unclear, but...
No, it's a great question. Historians for the past few decades, following from a historian called Benedict Anderson, like to think of a nation as what he calls an imagined community. So it doesn't necessarily mean that nations are completely made up, but the unifying idea is that people agree that they share something in common with each other. Many commentators have talked about whether what makes a nation is sharing a language or a climate or bloodlines or a form of government. And what we're seeing specifically in the French context is that some of the borders that we like to think of as natural to France today, that familiar hexagon shape, really emerged during this period under Louis XIV's foreign policy. One of the points that I made in my dissertation is that the conquering of Franche-Comté and a few other of these territories amounted to a kind of colonialism over land. That is to say, Louis XIV is trying to conquer adjacent territories and make them more French. And he does this using some of the same techniques that the French are also using overseas. So they create elite schools, they create incentives for integration. They try to kind of use both the carrot and the stick. And the difference here in retrospect is that these territories successfully became part of France and still are, whereas many overseas colonies from this period, including Haiti and Louisiana and so on, are no longer part of France, even though they may be part of what we call a francophonie, the French-speaking world. There are some natural boundaries that he's looking towards, rivers and mountain ranges and so on, and some of them in fact go back even to territories that were held by the Emperor Charlemagne around the year 800. Well, this is territory that it seems like Louis XIV is trying to claim back.
Set us up on a linear timeline right now. Where are we?
Sure. Well, we're in the third quarter of the 1600s, the 17th century. Before the conquest, before Louis XIV's armies come in, Besançon actually had close ties to German lands. So the Holy Roman Empire is an agglomeration of states headed by an elected emperor, but he's always elected from the same family, the Habsburgs. And Besançon is actually an important free imperial city under the Holy Roman Empire. They do not have a lord, they do not have a local prince, they are kind of directly under the emperor himself, but the emperor doesn't have the bandwidth to be overseeing all of these free imperial cities across the empire. And so what that means is that Besançon actually has a large number of privileges. It's a very special kind of place to live if you're an elite bourgeois of the kind of finance or mercantile class. And we see this most especially during the Renaissance when the Granvelle family from Besançon becomes important advisors to the Holy Roman Emperor. So Nicolas Granvelle is basically number 2 for the Holy Roman Emperor himself. This kind of gets forgotten today because the Germans don't remember the Granvelle family because they're in a French-speaking land now, and the French don't really remember the family because they were serving the German emperor. Their family mansion is now the Musée du Temps, the important civic museum of time and clockmaking in Besançon. The story of the conquest really picks up around 1660. So France and Spain have been at war for many, many years as part of this dynastic conflict between the French Bourbon and the Habsburg dynasties. As part of the brokering of a peace treaty in 1659, Louis XIV, the young king, agrees to marry the Spanish infanta, a princess named Maria Teresa, who happens to also be his first cousin. This is one of the terms of the Treaty of the Pyrenees. They stage a whole kind of wedding celebration on an island in the river in the Pyrenees Mountains that separates France and Spain. So Louis XIV put forward the case through this obscure Roman law that he should inherit his wife's family's crown instead of a male heir in the Spanish line. This is some megalomaniacal fake news, Sage. Like, that's not
I was about
something...
to say.
So the Spanish naturally disagree. They claim that the crown has to be passed through the male line, so a daughter can't inherit the crown and pass it to her husband. This is kind of a thorny constitutional question. It's not as straightforward as it seems on the surface. This is one that the French philosopher Montesquieu would write about in his Spirit of the Laws in the Enlightenment a generation or two later. So Louis XIV went to war to advance this dubious claim that he should inherit all his wife's family's crown and lands as part of this foreign policy aimed at expansion. He sees it as kind of defending his claim to Habsburg lands. They see this as total nonsense. Like, you slap a Latin name on whatever you think you deserve and you go to war for it, right? So this is in 1667, and it's called the War of Devolution, based on the idea, first of all, that she could inherit them, and second, that they should devolve to Louis XIV by virtue of his marriage. So this involved a campaign in Franche-Comté in February of 1668, and eventually they brokered a peace treaty at Aix-la-Chapelle, and the terms included that Louis XIV would withdraw from Franche-Comté. So he gets checked and has to leave Besançon after conquering it once. But as we know, Besançon is a city, it's so nice, he has to conquer it twice, so the peace would be short, and Louis XIV tries again. In 1674, we're now in the Franco-Dutch War. He's still kind of concerned with the Spanish Netherlands, so the Spanish crown basically has this claim to the Low Countries in the north of France. And so Vauban, this military engineer and architect, the Grand Condé, who's the kind of leading nobleman who had defended Louis XIV in an earlier conflict and whose family was very powerful in Burgundy, supervised laying siege to Besançon a second time, and this time they won. So in the 1678 treaty now, France acquired Besançon, moves the capital of the region from Dole to Besançon. They put the parliament there. They get the university going. And really this ushers in that beau siècle, the beautiful century between the conquest, that's to say in 1674, and the outbreak of the French Revolution just over a century later.
And when the king died, he said, it's a legend, but he said, j'ai trop aimé la guerre.
I loved war too much.
Yeah, as if he conceived that it was too much war.
That he regretted, yeah.
And for people, it was sometimes worse as in the Middle Age to live in this century.
But at the same time, it's not just a myth. It's not just a kind of discourse about history. There's some truth to it. During this century, 1 in 5 Europeans was French. The French has the largest army, as a result of having the largest population, maybe. This is the moment when people all over Europe really start to speak and converse in French. I mean, elites, at least, in the 18th century, speak French as a kind of common international language, the way that English is today, that Latin was before. And this really begins during Louis XIV's, kind of...
Yeah, it's a turning point because it's also a model for all the kings in Europe, and when he was still living when the 18th century began, because he died in 1715, and in Besançon it was a time where the city was totally rebuilt, modernized. It was a time of peace, a lot of artistic production. If you walk in the city of Besançon, what you see today, and it's something that you don't see in Paris, for example, we see a city of the 18th century. We don't have the high buildings of the 19th century. The streets have not changed since the 18th century. So we had originally one main street, which is still called the main street, Le Grand Rue, like in a village. Only we don't have this name for a city.
Something that did change, however, was what sat at the top of the main hill in the city.
He made something really violent when we think of it. There was a church above the cathedral, the Saint-Etienne church, where the members of the chapter of the cathedral were buried. So chapter, it was the college of the clerics of the cathedral around the archbishop. So their tombs were in this church, Saint-Etienne. It was demolished to build the citadel. So a way to show that the power, the royal power was dominating the religious one.
Tell me more about Saint Etienne.
So the Saint-Etienne church was built on a hillside overlooking the town of Besançon. So it's quite a prestigious and powerful position. This is where the bishops of the cathedral were historically buried. Rather than interring these important prelates in the crypt of the cathedral itself, they were interred on the hillside. And so this is an important site for the history of Christianity in Besançon, which goes back, 1,500 years before the period that we're talking about, even, remarkably, maybe a little more than that. This church of Saint-Etienne was raised by Louis XIV during the Conquest in order to replace it with the citadel. And so what happened at that site, we don't want to read too much into it, but it's kind of a metonym for Louis XIV, aggressively staking a temporal claim to the governance of the city at the expense of these different corporate bodies that each maintained their own fiefdom. So the archbishop, whose own domain could be operated using his own legal administration. And so here Louis XIV is really asserting his own dominance. And so from the perspective of the citadel, this is the founding moment of the kind of modern militaristic reach of the maybe beneficent state. And from the perspective of the cathedral, this is a serious blow.
And from either direction, I mean, the image of raising a church that is on a high hill, that is a burial ground for bishops, and replacing it with a military compound, that's a pretty significant shift. In a lot of ways, that hill is kind of central to the identity of Besançon,
Absolutely.
It's so identifiable. So that switch, I think, is definitely very significant.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it was a way for the king to say, yeah, I'm the master of the new region, and the archbishop, we deconstruct your power.
Why was the Archbishop of Besançon so powerful before the conquest? He had a prestigious relic, the Holy Shroud of Besançon. I don't know if you know it.
Well, I've heard of the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, it's the one everyone knows, but there was also one in Besançon.
So here we're talking about a shroud. That's a literal shroud, correct?
Sort of, right? So this is the garment that's supposedly used to cover Jesus' body after his execution, and it's considered a holy relic. But, real, imagined. I mean, it sounds like there was a garment there. I don't know, but I don't know if, there was fabric there.
Yes.
I don't know if it was
we can't
2,000-year-old.
Yeah.
Exactly, fabric. I don't want to wade into that controversy.
Neither did Mathieu.
Exactly. So, which is the real shroud? Or are there different shrouds?
I won't answer this question, it's too political. But some historians try to explain why there are two shrouds. And the one of Besançon, there was just the face of the Christ, and it was orange. So they said that the one in Turin was the shroud used when he was taken down the cross, and it was closed on him. So we have the face and the back, and it's red because of the blood. And Besançon, it was a shroud made, and given to the Christ when he was already dead, with the creams, the onguent, used to prepare the body, the corpse. So that's why we just have the face and it's orange, the color of the spices and the products used for the entombment.
To prepare the corpse. Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of theories. It was also contested. A lot of historians said already in the 18th century it's a fake. Don't go there. But it was still
the 18th century, critical historiographers writing in
some
the
of
humanist
them
tradition.
Besançon, yeah.
Okay.
It came here and it was conserved here in this part of the cathedral. So when they saw that the bell tower was collapsing, they took the relic away with all the archives and the treasure of the cathedral that was conserved in the bell tower. They took the opportunity of the rebuilding of the apse to make a huge reliquaire,
a reliquary,
and an exhibition place for the relic.
Okay.
That's why in the paintings, if you watch the 3 main paintings of the cycle, we always see the shroud exhibited.
I didn't see a shroud. When we went to the
No, there
cathedral,
was
we
no
saw
shroud.
a reliquary, but there's no shroud there, so...
Oh no, I hate to ask this. Where is the shroud?
If you know the story of the revolution, you know what happened, but I will tell you also there are 2 different stories.
Okay.
When the conquest happened, the king came here and he asked to the clergy to see the shroud. And when it was finished also, they made copies, they sent to Spain. In the revolution, people were interested to debunk the myth of the shroud. The shroud was taken to the trial and condemned to become paper, so Sharpie.
To become paper?
To be destroyed and to be reused as a normal cloth in paper. And so it was a way to destroy the sanctity of the relic. And it was brought to Paris and it disappeared at this time. But some people in Besançon think that it was saved and is somewhere. But it's a legend for us.
There's a whole medieval tradition of putting animals on trial, for instance. Like you put somebody's dog on trial for witchcraft or something like that. And the revolutionaries who think that they're creating a world based entirely on reason are still kind of taking those old regime rituals that have meaning for them, and they're just using it, against the church, for their secularization or de-Christianization program. But in a way, it taps into these very old ways of thinking about or of achieving a kind of communal healing.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And we still find today, and it was shown in the exhibition Le Beau Siècle, a lot of prints made with the shroud, because for the pilgrimage you could purchase a copy of the shroud, which was also kind of relic. Some of them were made on linen, on cloth. So it was kind of a shroud itself. And we could, I can show you some pictures because it's really easy to find on eBay, for example.
And we talk so much of the pilgrims, buying like pilgrimage tokens and coins that are, printed on metal. It's interesting to hear that there's also the cloth version.
Yeah, a lot of
That's
these.
beautiful.
Yeah, you see here, it's like tickets. Wow. You can cut it and bring it. And
like a roll of tickets, and each one has a print on it.
Wow.
Okay.
So it was a really commercial thing. We know that 30,000 people could come to Besançon to see the shroud when there was an exhibition.
Like Turin. A little bit like people would come.
Yeah, pilgrimage, pilgrims. So it was important for the Archbishop, and they have lost it. So today we are amazed by this decoration, but we have to understand that we have just part of the disposition of the 18th century.
I don't know about you, I loved meeting Mathieu. I just thought he was brilliant. He has such a deep sense of the history and such a great communicator. We had a fun time.
It was a great time in a beautiful space, and we really got to see a lot of the inner workings of the cathedral as an architectural beauty.
For me, I think the lesson was not to necessarily make prejudgments about what is and is not pertinent, but to go in with an open mind and really to try and explore the city and its landmarks with our research questions in mind, not knowing exactly where it might lead us. After learning about how, during the Conquest, Louis XIV's armies destroyed the Church of Saint-Étienne, kind of demolishing with it some of the temporal power of the Archbishop and of the Cathedral, I think it would make sense for us to go and visit the citadel that Louis XIV had installed on that site to kind of pick up and see where the story goes. You know, what's happening with the Conquest? How did this happen? So I think from the Cathedral, that's definitely the next spot, is to go up the massive, massive hillside and to check out the citadel.
What a trek.
Yeah, and it's hot in the summer too,
It's
right?
very hot.
Donc, je m'appelle Gaëlle Cavalli.
So my name is Gaëlle Cavalli. I'm the manager of the department for the promotion of the Vauban Monument, which means seeing the citadel as Vauban's legacy, because there are other museum curators here in charge of the other aspects of the citadel. My job really consists in promoting the site.
Gaëlle Cavalli is a kind of, you might think of a museum curator for architecture. So her job is to take the kind of cultural patrimony in France and to kind of make it come alive for the general public. So she's interfacing both with scholars and researchers and with the general population, people of all stripes who come and are curious to learn more about the citadel.
We are sitting here in a citadel that was designed by Vauban at the end of the 17th century on behalf of Louis XIV. Because up until 1674, the province of Franche-Comté was not French, but was under the control of the Habsburg family, which meant under the control of the Spanish crown. Louis XIV conquered Franche-Comté and asked Vauban to strengthen this new French frontier city. This place is a citadel, part of a fortified unit aimed at protecting the city of Besançon, but also aimed at keeping an eye on the city, since not all people living in Franche-Comté were necessarily pleased to become French. There was a governor for the citadel, but his role was really tied to the stronghold, and so in Franche-Comté, there was an intendant in charge of the province.
En Franche-Comté, on avait un intendant qui, lui, gérait la province. Donc,
this is also when Besançon gained more recognition and became more important. The university was transferred here from Dole. Similarly, the political capital of the province moved from Dole to Besançon.
So the story of the architecture of the citadel actually begins with the invention of gunpowder, and more specifically, cannonballs.
This type of architecture wasn't appropriate anymore, especially because of the cast iron cannonballs developed at the end of the Middle Ages. Such walls are too easily destroyed. In Italy, they developed what are called bastion forts. Bastion fort architecture is characterized by much stockier dimensions and walls supported by large earthworks.
Très large. Et donc, quand les boulets de canon arrivent sur le mur, eh bien, en fait, la terre va amortir les chocs.
When cannonballs hit the walls, the earthworks will cushion the shock and absorb the shock, protecting the ramparts. And the reason behind the star shape, simply because it permitted crossfire. When cannons are installed on your bastions, they can be fired without creating blind spots, unlike previous rounded shapes, where enemies could move forward and were sheltered from defending fire. So that's the purpose of this new type of architecture.
Les ennemis peuvent finalement s'avancer et être protégés des tirs. Donc voilà l'intérêt de cette nouvelle architecture.
What was so interesting to learn about Vauban is how many of his ideas are not what you would expect. So he's advocating for all kinds of policies, for instance, for redistributing wealth to the poor that would seem to be revolutionary for their time, that the monarchy wouldn't necessarily agree with. He's really pushing the envelope.
Et donc lui, il a proposé une dîme royale qui
Vauban was the one who proposed a royal tithe called the dîme, applicable to everyone in French society.
Very controversial.
This was quite daring for the 17th century. He also wrote books on pig farming, for instance, where he studies pig production, writing that it should be more developed because it would make feeding the kingdom easier, etc. He also criticized Louis XIV for his decision to revoke the Edict of Nantes, an action that denied Protestants freedom of religion, saying that it was a mistake because, as a consequence, many Protestants left the Kingdom of France, and especially people from this very region.
Because of the proximity to the Swiss border?
The Swiss border, yes, as well as the German border. It is especially true for the land of Montbéliard, which is now part of Franche-Comté. This was also the time where the barrack system was developed and implemented. Before that, soldiers were housed in private homes. We really owe this change to Vauban, and this aspect was one of the reasons behind the election of the site to the UNESCO World Heritage. This is Vauban's influence over the world. His legacy continued in architecture up until the 19th century, and in artillery, where we owe him major evolutions for 2 centuries. His influence can be found in architecture from all around the world, from the Citadel of Quebec to buildings in Vietnam. There was a system of central staircase with 2 barrack rooms on each side and on each floor. Housing for soldiers is reproduced from the system of modules, of basic cells, which was elaborated and developed during Vauban's time.
So the citadel was built by the Spanish, but they were following Vauban's plans, and this was before the French then regained the hill. Can you explain how this all happened?
Of course. Earlier, I simplified things a little, saying that Franche-Comté was conquered in 1674, but really it was a 2-step process. There was a first conquest in 1668. At this occasion, Louis XIV asked Vauban to start designing plans. Then, because of the treaty between France and Spain, Franche-Comté was returned to the Spanish in exchange for other territories, particularly in the north.
So this was after the wedding of Louis XIV in 1660 to 1661.
Yes, because one of Louis XIV's alibi, as we can say to conquer Franche-Comté,
was the idea that he would inherit his wife's family lands.
Exactly. So he asked Vauban to design some plans, etc. But when Franche-Comté is returned to Spain, the Spanish realized that it might be a good idea to reinforce the citadel a little.
So how did the Spanish get the plans?
I do not know.
There must have been a spy somewhere.
There might have been. It is also possible that there was a leak, since although Vauban designed the plans, he was relying on local architects for the construction work.
So there was probably a whole team behind him. It wasn't just Vauban on his own?
Indeed. Once Franche-Comté was reconquered during the Besançon siege of 1674, Vauban took over the Spanish citadel, kept some elements but completed it, and strengthened the defenses. Legend has it that he described the citadel by saying that it's a quite beautiful citadel, but we only have the bones. So he had to complete it, especially in terms of rampart size, because the Spanish made the fortifications a lot lower, and Vauban, during the siege of Besançon, got up on the hills on each side around the citadel. You can see the hills if you walk along the ramparts, which are higher than the Saint-Étienne Mount, and so he managed to bombard the inside of the citadel from there.
Sur les remparts, qui sont plus hautes en fait que la colline Saint-Étienne, et donc a réussi à bombarder en fait l'intérieur de la citadelle. On met encore des.
But it seems logical, since he was the person who designed it. He would know the weak spots of the citadel. It would have been impossible for him to lose, right?
Because of that, he really completed it by adding another front at the bottom, by making the ramparts higher, etc.
So, Ben, what did you take away from your conversation with Gaël Cavalli about the architect Vauban?
You know, one thing I was a little bit surprised by is how much of the narrative and memory at the Citadel revolves around Vauban. So one of the first things you see when you walk in the outer gates is a big modern statue of Vauban in 18th century dress. And they sell replicas of it in the gift shop, and I almost bought one, but I didn't. You remember that?
I do remember.
Yeah, exactly.
It was so heavy, though.
Yeah, I know. I went with books instead. But I mean, there's so much that's interesting about Vauban, but you know, the guy can't produce 100 fortified castles around the perimeter of France by himself. And so he depended on so many others, and we don't really know that much, it seems to me, about like how it was that one guy could design all these fortresses around France. How did the Spanish get Vauban's plans to begin with when they beat back Louis XIV the first time? Isn't it obvious, too, that Vauban would be able to reconquer the bastions that he himself designed? Like, he should know what their weak points are.
Yeah, I will say the deification of Vauban reminded me so much of Charlottesville.
And I do think in Charlottesville, we're having this kind of reappraisal of the sort of so-called great men of history. So we know a lot more now about how Thomas Jefferson worked with others. We know a lot more about the enslaved people who lived at Monticello as well.
And who accomplished much of these grand buildings, you know, that they actually were laying the bricks of the university and stuff like that.
So what else can we find out about the folks besides Vauban who are living and working around the citadel? I mean, is this a kind of like a university, like a single-sex men's barracks kind of situation? What kind of community is this?
Parce que c'est vrai qu'on peut avoir l'idée d'une...
One might imagine the citadel to represent what we would later see during the 19th century, meaning a very masculine and enclosed social space. During the 17th and 18th century, as recent research conducted on places like the citadel of Lille shows, that wasn't the case at all. We worked with a PhD student who studies these questions, and we found that in a way, many things were also applicable to the citadel of Besançon.
Des enfants aussi.
For instance, there were many women, children too, even though soldiers technically didn't have the right to marry and had to remain single for their 6 years' commitment in the army. In reality, we have records of christenings and weddings being celebrated at the Citadel's chapel. There were also at least 2 inns, which meant the presence of innkeepers and their wives, their kids. It was very open to the city, and there were also washerwomen who would come to do the soldiers' laundry, etc. Soldiers could also work outside of the citadel to add some money to their pay. It was very permeable.
So it was a citadel, but also a city.
In Italian, citadella means small city, and indeed that is what we have here. This isn't an enclosed space at all. We can imagine that the governor had connections with the city's nobility.
It turns out that Louis XIV's investment in Besançon as an important military site has enduring consequences for the city of Besançon today.
Alors, Besançon a toujours été une ville militaire et l'est encore, puisque c'est le...
Besançon has always been a military city and still is today because the Eastern Army Command is in Besançon. As a matter of fact, the largest employer after the city and the university is the army.
And the Eastern Army is?
Ground forces, but in the east of France, which is the reason why there are still many barracks here. During the 18th century, they took up a lot of space in the city. For instance, there is the Sorel Barracks, which is just at the bottom of the citadel. I myself live right next to the Vauban Barracks, located on the small hill.
Of course you do.
There have always been barracks, and I think the military has always played a role from time to time. You can also see members of the military jog in the citadel, run to the top of the fortifications, etc. So there are still strong ties between the city and the military.
Coming from Charlottesville, the citadel is an incredible site and also an unfamiliar one. But we also have to keep in mind that around the perimeter of France, this architect Vauban built over 100 of these kinds of fortifications. One of the things that I'm curious about is what makes this site in Besançon so unique and so special.
What I find really quite extraordinary is how the city managed to preserve almost the entirety of its fortifications, which is quite rare in France, especially for the city walls of early modern towns, because of the development of cars, etc. So I think we are very lucky, and we are also lucky to have preserved remnants of Vauban's strategic landscape. Of course, the city grew in size, but it is still fairly easy to understand its geostrategic positioning, and that's part of what makes it a pleasant place to live in. I don't know what your impressions are of Besançon, but it is a very green city with plenty of history.
So do you want to walk around a little bit, and we'll kind of look at? I mean, it's a hot day, but I also think we're about to get an amazing view of the panorama of the city. There's a way in which it seems like the steps that Louis XIV undertook to integrate Besançon into the French kingdom after he conquered it were pretty successful during this period. You know, so it's worth thinking about how he did that, right? And so on the one hand, we have these programs of kind of cultural integration and moral integration. On the other, we have this kind of military fortress, and, you know, my guess is that they go hand in hand.
Right.
Another interesting thing about walking around the space that I'm noticing is that, you know, unlike a lot of the other 18th century buildings that we've been looking at this week, this one is just not symmetrical at all. It's not built in a classical style. It could have had those kinds of ornaments, but they actually don't. And that goes back to, I think, what Gail was saying about how it's really built to be integrated into the kind of geography of this space or the topography of it. And so that makes it also a little bit awkward to visit. It's almost modernist, right? Because it's not symmetrical and you've got these jagged edges everywhere. You don't know what shape to expect. So we're at these musical chairs, I guess, and each chair has a different piece of music from the 17th, 18th century. So I said that there's no moat. I guess I kind of lied.
Wow.
I mean, at least there's no water in it, but...
Yeah, there's no water.
Yeah.
Oh, but there are monkeys.
It is kind of a ditch. Are you serious?
Right there.
Where?
Yeah, this is part of the zoo.
Oh my God, the zoo is here. I guess they did repurpose it.
Wow. I love that, personally.
So the other thing that she talked about is that as part of the ecological movement of the city, they had a big controversy where they decided to stop lighting the citadel at night.
Oh.
So you've noticed that at night it's not like the Eiffel Tower or
Right.
even like in Athens or something where the main monument in town is sort of lit up with floodlights. You can see it from everywhere, and they could have continued doing that, but for environmental reasons, to protect the flora and fauna, and because of the energy costs, they decided not to do it. It's a tough balance to strike between ecology and culture, right? Because it's a beautiful kind of tourist site to be able to light up, but it's also kind of a testament to the values of the city that it's not lit up. It actually shows their forward-thinkingness.
Yeah, absolutely. I've never, come across a place that is serving both as a historical monument and a zoo.
Yeah.
This is really interesting and very beautiful.
And it's sort of not set up like a menagerie. I mean, these monkeys have this whole ditch to be roaming around in.
Oh my gosh, I just can't believe it.
What I was amazed to hear about is that, just like the war effort might engage a quarter of the French population at a time like the 18th century, Gail Cavalli explained to us about how the citadel is an entire community. If there's still a sense that the space was kind of designed by this one architectural military genius, Vauban, we don't get that sense about life in the space itself. So we learned all about how many different kinds of people lived and worked there, how many people are involved in provisioning the space, and how there would be taverns and restaurants like up on the hill within the outer walls of the fortification itself. So it really is kind of a little city there.
And in fact, it doesn't even sound like there was very much of a divide between the Citadel community and the community it was surveilling down in Besançon. It sounds like there was a lot of trade and commerce between those two groups. As much as it at times seems like, the Citadel's up there to watch out for the inculcation of revolution in the town, it doesn't seem like that's actually what's happening in a socializing sense between those two groups.
And I think there's more that we can learn about this. I mean, I totally agree with you. At the same time, I remember what an effort is to trek up that hill, especially in the summer. And you think, once you're up that hill, you are there for the day. You're going to go to the zoo. You're going to go to the aquarium, the fish tanks in the zoo. You're going to, sit in the restaurant, have a coffee. So I do also get the sense that maybe just that logistical separation of what it takes to go up and down the hill, just by virtue of the hike to get up there, I would imagine that there is some separation between the garrison town and the city below. It's funny though, from here we would need to actually go back down to the lower layer of the citadel to get a better view of the cathedral.
Yeah, the cathedral.
But we can see the shape of the city so well from here. I mean, you can just see where the river goes.
Right, just that line of green.
Because we have this like kind of semicircle shape of all of the tile roofs. Then the ring of trees that flank the river on both sides, and then beyond that, the kind of modern apartment buildings all around it. I don't think I realized that outside of the river, it was as built up as this.
Yeah, I don't think so either.
So actually, there's like kind of a big residential, semi-urban city around the river, and this kind of greater Besançon. The countryside is then kind of beyond that. This really gives you a good perspective.
Yeah, the green belt is what they call the trees.
Okay.
Lining the river.
And you can kind of see from up here why. Interesting that they have the EU flag up there, right? And the French flag on the other side. Sister Revolutions is a limited-run documentary series made possible by the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission, Brown Residential College at the University of Virginia, and America 2026. You can learn more about each of these organizations on their websites, CvilleSisterCities.org, browncollege.virginia.edu, and America2026.eu. Sister Revolutions is produced and hosted by Dr. Benjamin Bernard and Sage Tanguay, with production assistance from Sophia Moore, French transcription and translation by Oriane Guiziou-Lamour, and English voiceover by Tracey Gerlach. The music in this episode was provided by Blue Dot Sessions. This episode featured the voices of Dr. Katlyn Carter from the University of Notre Dame, Mathieu Fantoni from the Cathedral Saint-Jean of Besançon, Gaël Cavalli from the Citadel in Besançon, and Noël Antolin and Stevie Berns. We'd like to extend a special thanks to Elizabeth Smiley of the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission, Bertrand von Rumbeck of America 2026, Professor Ari Blatt, Chair of the University of Virginia French Department, Florent Verrier, Head of International Relations for the City of Besançon, and Hugo Tudik, Associate Director of the University of Chicago Center in Paris. Sister Revolutions is hosted by Symposia, a production of Brown Residential College at the University of Virginia, and the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM.